Ah, welcome back. Okay, so we're going to talk about white privilege. And I need to preface this discussion real quick about what we're going to be discussing and some of the issues that I have experienced teaching this part of the class. Inevitably, I end up having one of my students, when we were face to face in person classes, one of my students argue against white privilege. And it usually stems from a white guy who, sits up and says, I do not engage in white privilege. I do not have white privilege. I've never experienced white privilege. And the student says, like, I grew up in poverty, right? I grew up in a time where a time and a place where there was equality, but I also grew up poor. So how can I have privilege, right? How can I have privilege over someone else when I didn't have the resources that other people did? And my ultimate response to that sort of an argument is that this isn't necessarily about you, right? This isn't about you as an individual, or necessarily about your experience being poor. As I grew up poor, I didn't have all the resources that a lot of other people had, but I still recognize that there are things that being a white male has given me opportunity, and in some cases, not. I think we have to sort of define privilege as not only being extra opportunity, but just normal behavior that is not given to others. And I think that's a really important thing to understand, is that while white privilege is this issue. So that's quickly define white privilege, okay? It is a legacy of opportunity, oppression, control, active and passive racism, unearned advantages, and benefits. Okay? So here's the thing. You might have grown up poor or not, right? But if you've ever walked into a store, right? If you've ever walked into an electronics store as a white guy, and you've gone around the entire store, and you've had people come up to you and ask for help, or if you need help, and if you say yes or say no, if you say no, then you just walk away, and then they go back to doing whatever it is that they're normally doing. That's privilege. And the reason why that's privilege is that you can have the same person as a store employee, and you have a black man or a person of color come in and wander around the store, and then this person follows behind them, right? Because they might be a threat, a theft risk, right? Based on their color. And that's privilege, right? Even though nothing special happened for you, nothing special was about it, you just walked in as a normal white guy and didn't have to deal with any of these issues. That is an unearned privilege above other people that do experience this, that do experience some sort of racist event, a microaggression, you know. And that's where sort of white privilege, sort of a lot of people don't recognize, that you have been given opportunities that might seem extra, but are oftentimes very much normal behavior that other people don't get because of their skin color. And most white Americans never recognize this, right? They've never had that person following behind them, that the being able to walk into a bank and deal with a teller, or take out a loan, it's just normal behavior, right? To be able to apply for a job and to be able to get that job because your name is easy to pronounce. Right? Because there are lots of people named Bill or Joe out there. It's common. It's explainable. I know what that behavior is going to be, but if I have someone that comes in that has a different name, one that I don't recognize, right? I don't know what their behavior is going to be like, right? They become an unknown issue, and so we see these events that are tied into institutional racism, that are tied into microaggressions, that are tied into individual racism, that are tied to white privilege. That even if you do not do anything yourself, you're not a racist, right? You're just a guy that's trying to make their way through the world, right? And you have black friends, right? And you have people of color in your family, right? And how could you ever be perceived as being racist? Well, you're not. You're not racist, and it's not about you, right? It's about the fact that all of these things happen to other people, right? This isn't an individual thing. This is a community. This is a cultural thing. So when we talk about white privilege, it's oftentimes seen as something that, like, I don't have it, right? This is not one of my problems. I'm a good person. I live my life well. I have, I treat people fairly and equally. Yeah, that's fine. That's great. That's the way it should be. Doesn't mean that you don't or haven't experienced white privilege, right? So, and I think that's the thing that we have to recognize, is that, this is still something that's taking place, even though we don't often see it, right? We don't experience it, especially in communities that are oftentimes segregated. Maybe not intentionally, but if you live in a white neighborhood, or if you go to a school that is all white, then you might not see it. You might not experience it. Doesn't mean that it's not happening. And I think that's the ignorance of a lot of white men, that they don't see it, so they don't believe it. And I've had this conversation many, many times with good people, but they don't want to take responsibility for these kinds of things taking place. And I get it. But it still happens. It's still there. So here's part of the other exercise. What are some of the ways that white privilege is expressed? How do we see it? How do we experience it? And I gave a few examples, but how else might we see it? So I want you to take a few minutes to think about this. What are some of the things that you might see, and maybe you have experienced this. Take a moment and think about it. Okay, let's go into some examples here. Right, going shopping without being followed. Right, I already gave that example. Not having race be a concern when dealing with financial concerns, right? Being able to go into a bank and getting access to funds, and again, this isn't as big of a problem as it used to be, right? When we do have a lot of laws, and we do have a lot of people that are dealing with these issues, and it's becoming more and more fair. But it doesn't mean that it's gone away, right? Seeing people of your race being widely represented in the news and media and in education. And this is, again, this is one of those things that that we have to consider is, okay, so for example, when we look at people who commit crimes, right? So say there's kind of a high visibility case that's being brought up. Somebody committed a crime and it gets onto the news and people are talking about it. Historically speaking, if a black man were to commit that crime, you would see a mugshot, right? You'd see them in their in prison clothing with the background and the whole 9 yards, and they would look like a criminal, right? They committed a crime, and now they look like a criminal. However, if you're a white guy, right, and you commit the same crime, or even a worse crime, like I've seen examples of white guys who killed their families, right, killed their wife, killed their kids, and instead of showing a mugshot, they show a picture of the guy with his family in a photo, and they're standing there. It's like at a family picnic, and they're all smiling, and you know, what kind of an impact does that have? What kind of an impact does that have when you see a black man that looks like a criminal in a criminal situation, you know, versus a white man with their family and looking happy? And what kind of an impact will that have on juries, right? If all you see are, you know, black men that whenever their faces get plastered on the news, they look like criminals, versus white guys over here that, you know, oftentimes with their families and they look happy, you know, and maybe they're not as guilty, right? Because they seem happy, right? You can have that impact, that emotional impact, right, of how people are represented. And that's privilege, right? This is privilege, you know, of being represented in a way that is going to be more or less detrimental. Language or clothing, educational traits that are attributed to your race. Okay. Again, this goes back to ideas of intelligence, right? Racial ideas of intelligence, and that there's a difference, right? That there is certain clothing that that is attributed to one particular group or another, that has a negative connotation to it. Wearing baggy pants, you know, is oftentimes one that's brought up. You know, if you wear baggy pants, then you must be a criminal, and the likelihood of wearing baggy pants is that you're a person of color that wears baggy pants, right? Or education or language, right? We had in was it Ebonics, I believe it was, if I remember correctly, in California, where they were trying to use different language techniques to reach out to these kids that spoke differently. They didn't speak sort of the Midwestern English that that a lot of the country speaks. In this part of California, in Oakland, and also in LA and other places where you've got slang, you've got different types of cultural influences where standard English wasn't being used, and they were attributing it to a particular lifestyle or a particular education level, or the particular ability to have that education, right? And it became discriminatory. And these practices were eventually left behind because they were seen as that. But you know, if you speak a certain way, right? If you use certain terminology, it can reflect upon your ability to gain access, right? If you go into a bank and you aren't speaking proper, Midwestern English, will you be treated differently? And the answer is generally yes, right? And people, oftentimes don't necessarily do it intentionally, but it still happens, right? There's still something, that's not comfortable, that some people recognize that they're like, oh, I don't, I'm experiencing this and it makes me uncomfortable when I can't say this guy's name, or if we can't communicate in a way that is, as efficient as using my traditional English, right? Getting pulled over by police, right? I've been pulled over by police for multiple reasons: speeding, curfew. I got pulled over for curfew once. Doing stupid young things, as a kid. Not once have I ever feared for my life being pulled over. Not once. Never has it ever crossed my mind that, I could die from being pulled over by police. I don't live in a community where that happens, right? And I'm white. I don't have to worry about that. In fact, I've had some very interesting and fun conversations with police as they have pulled me over, and I've gained valuable information from these police, because we have, we talk about certain things and talk about, speeding, talk about tires, talk about, speedometers and how they have to be adjusted, and every once in a while, and all this stuff, right? Not once have I ever been concerned about my safety. That's privilege. That's privilege. That should be normal behavior, right? If you're, you might be doing something wrong, but you shouldn't have to worry about, your life being threatened. So, if you're a person of color and you get pulled over, and we've seen this happen many times in recent years, where we see the footage of it. We see the footage of this taking place, of perfectly acceptable behavior, normal behavior of what should be happening, and then something triggers an event, right? And somebody gets shot and somebody gets killed. So those things have to be, understood as privilege. Not getting immediate service or being bypassed because of your race. Going into a restaurant, right? You go into a restaurant, and so here's an example. You're a family. You walk into a restaurant, and you don't get seated as quickly as some other people might get seated, or the waitress doesn't come over as quickly, because the waitress has had this experience in the past where, like, African American families don't tip as much. Right? They don't tip as much, and this is this person's experience. And so this waitress doesn't come over as quickly, and they sit there for a little bit longer, and then their order is eventually taken, and and maybe their food doesn't come out as quickly, right? That waitress, she's busy, she's doing other things, but she's working with other people a little bit more, and the food comes out, maybe it's a little bit cold. And this family recognizes that, hey, my service wasn't that great, so maybe I'm not going to tip as well, right? And so when they get up to leave, they pay their bill, and they don't quite tip as well as someone else did, because their service wasn't as good. And then that waitress, whose ideas about black families that are coming in that don't tip as well, that idea gets reinforced, right? Because she just experienced it again because her service was influenced by the fact that hasn't been tipped as well in the past. And her tip wasn't as good this time, and so her efforts towards the next time aren't going to be as good, right? And this goes back to this normalized behavior patterns, right? This becomes this aspect of people behaving in a certain way because this is what's happened all the time. It's normal. And yet, it's based on these aspects of privilege and microaggressions. And so we have to look at those kinds of behaviors. How do we change that? How do we change what's happening? And yeah, there's certainly progression in this country. There's been a lot of progression, but that doesn't mean we're not still experiencing it. And there's lots of ways. There are lots of examples where, white privilege and microaggressions and all of these things take place and are oftentimes not recognized, right? We don't see it taking place. We don't see it happening because it's been a normalized behavior, right? It's become an ideology, right? We see this taking place, and it happens once, it happens twice, and it becomes normalized. Even though there are no good reasons for it to really happen. If we look at race and class, and this is something that we still see taking place because of all the things that we've been talking about, institutionalized racism and access to resources and all of this stuff. And we look at even folks that have been able to increase their social status, right? That have done well for themselves, that have, they've achieved that American dream. They've been successful. They have a nice house. They have a nice car. They've got they're married. They've got the 2.4 kids and the white picket fence, right? American dream. And they have the dog, not the cat. Forget about the cat. It's all about the dogs. That's my bias. Sorry. But they will still experience. They might have the same wealth, right? They might have the same amount of money and stuff that, these other people might have, but they're still not seen in the same way, right? There's still this disparity in how people are treated, even if they've done well for themselves. And it's funny, I'll bring this up. I've always liked TV shows and, stuff like that. But I think about like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, okay, and using that TV show that oftentimes did deal with some really great subjects and dealing with racial inequality and stuff like that, and where you see that there were times when this family that's living in really a incredibly wealthy situation, right? And their needs are taken care of. There are still racial disparities. There are still people treating them differently based on race. So it's still there, right? Even if you climb that ladder, there's still going to be obstacles. And that's, I don't want to paint this terrible picture because I think that there are lots of people that are moving in the right way in this, being able to access these great opportunities and meeting great people and, more and more opportunity for kids and education. And it's getting better. But, as we move towards getting better, we have to realize that it's still worse. We're still not at where we should be. And so we have to keep that in mind as we're going forward. Okay, so we're finally at the conclusion. do anthropologists see difference biologically between races? And the answer is absolutely not, right? We are one race, the human race. Race is a cultural construct, okay? Race is seen in different ways around the world. And that is really important to understand, is that not everybody sees race the same way that we do. Lots of different cultures see race in different ways. And so, and those ideas and concepts change, right, from historical context to modern context. And we can see that in our own history. Race is a constructed cultural phenomenon and is treated around the world differently. I just said that. There are different types of racism, right? We have individual racism, we have microaggressions, we have institutional racism, we have racial ideology that tells us that being racist is okay, right? This is just something that's normal and acceptable, right? That these kinds of behaviors are normal and it's okay, right? And, using slavery as an example. It was morally acceptable. It was ethically acceptable to own slaves, right? Today, that isn't the case, right? But back then, it was acceptable. And so recognizing how things can be seen as normal behavior might not necessarily be normal, might not be right, even if it is seen as normal, that these attributes might be common. A lot of times there's more of a story behind it. There's more information to be found that can disprove some of those ideas. Microaggressions, the little things. It's the little events. The paper cuts that eventually kill, the pebbles that eventually bury, and they can have long-term social impact, right? If one thing is always shown, if somebody experiences, a whole bunch of slights, it can have that emotional, that intellectual, detrimental impact. So, think about that yourself. I think because microaggressions are oftentimes seen as so minor and normalized, how do you engage with people in your community, right? Do you commit microaggressions? Something to think about, something to reflect upon. How do you fit into your community? How do you fit into your society? And are there things that you can improve yourself? Be that reflexive, right? Recognize where you come from. I think that's, super important to understand. Me personally, I come from a racist family. My mom, she's fantastic, and I wouldn't say that she's got a racist bone in her body. She does, but it's pretty small. But my dad's side of the family, oh man. Whew. Growing up with them, I was exposed to all kinds of ideas and words that were used and concepts that, had a big impact on me when I was younger. And then I got educated, right? So recognizing where you come from, recognizing your own personal bias, recognizing that there are issues that we all have to deal with is extremely important as anthropologists, as researchers, recognizing our own biases, that if something happens, how do you explain it, right? So keeping that in mind, Um, White privilege is something that is oftentimes hidden, right? Especially for those of us who are white, and especially for those of us who are white men, right? We rarely ever see that privilege because that privilege has become normalized, right? We don't have to worry about going into a bank and not getting seen or heard or having the same kind of experience as everyone else. We just expect normalcy, right? We expect, to be treated well if we go into a restaurant. All of these things become normalized, and we don't see it as privilege, right? But it's when we experience something that somebody else doesn't get, as normal. And that's where we see a lot of these ideas of white privilege coming up and why we need to deal with them. And again, I really want to acknowledge the fact that, we have gone a very, very long way. We have come in a very short amount of time to create massive cultural change. One of the things that I like to point out is that if we go back to the Civil War, okay, that is literally just two lifetimes ago. Okay, for example, my grandfather, he would be in his early 80s right now if he still lived. But that's well within normal lifespan range. I mean, he knew people when he was a kid, right? When he was a kid, he met people that had fought in the Civil War. Okay, it's just like today, right? We see people in parades and stuff like that that fought in World War II. That was 80 years ago. 2 lifetimes, right? We've got someone that fights in the Civil War, and they live a long time. They meet somebody when they're really old, have an impact on them, and then they go on, and guess what? They make it till today. So the Civil War was literally 2 lifetimes ago. And we have gone from a slave-owning society to having all of these civil rights and ideas of equality and all of this stuff that has increased the value of our society, have increased the value of people's lives and their experiences. But we also have to recognize that it just wasn't that long ago. I mean, civil rights, the Civil Rights Act happened 12 years before I was born. That's not that long ago, right? The Fair Housing Act was 2 years before I was born, right? And I'm not that old. So we have to recognize that we have made massive changes and that those changes are really, really good. But we still have a long way to go. And it takes, in my opinion, anthropologists, to be able to help go in and find the causes, right? To recognize that, to educate about the issues that we are facing in this country, and to expose them, and to help people understand the issues that we're facing, right? A lot of the stuff that I've talked about prior to this lecture has really been about the process of education, right? And the process of being unbiased and being very scientific in approach to our research, and we still do that. We still, engage in this process of science, right? And we do this process so that we can remain unbiased, so that we can find that truth, right? Whatever that truth is, so that we can find it. But that doesn't mean that we can't get fired up about it too, And this is one of those subjects that, if we really want to be able to treat our neighbors and to have our neighbors treated equally to ourselves, that we need to be able to recognize the problems that are still existing, that we are still dealing with. So, when you go forward in your own life, keep in mind what might be happening with other people, right? What they might be experiencing, the kinds of things that they might be going through in their own lives, and why certain behavior might be different towards them versus yourself, right? If you have that privilege, to do that, use that privilege for good, right? Use your access. If you aren't experiencing that privilege, fight, fight for it. Make sure that we find that equality. And I think we will find it. Or at least we'll get pretty doggone close. I don't know if there's ever such a thing as perfect. I wish there was. And in this country, our concepts of freedom allow us to have really diverse ideas. Oh, hi, Bear. Have these really diverse ideas about what is appropriate for us to believe and to think and to behave. And that diversity can oftentimes lead to conflict. How do we deal with that conflict? And I think that's the most important thing that we can also do is how do we deal with these issues? How do we face them? And for me, it's all about civil discourse, right? Having the conversations that need to be made, having the conversations that point out inequality or ignorance or misunderstanding, right? Taking that time to do that. And maybe we can come to a better idealism, a more perfect union in this country. We'll never be able to achieve perfection, but we can get better, right? Anyway, I'm going to get off my soapbox and call it good. I hope that I hope you learned something, through these lectures. I hope that it makes you think about where we all stand in this society, and that if you're dealing with people, throughout the rest of your life, having compassion, having the ability to think outside of your normal box, right? Your normal life, and try and think about walking in someone else's shoes, and how you can have that positive impact. I think that's really important to think about as we move forward. So, yeah, homework, same thing. Reflection paper on what we've talked about. Have you ever experienced racism? Have you ever experienced, any of this? Has this brought up any new ideas? Does this connect to any other thoughts about gender equality or, anything like that? Write it down, whatever you got. Throw it my direction. I'll be interested in reading it. Yeah, okay, that's it. We'll see you next week. Take it easy.